Good day, colleagues, friends from all over the world, all over Africa. My name is Adeyinka Adeyemi. I am a senior advisor at the African Trade Policy Center at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Welcome to this Module 2 course titled Sources and Domestic Resource Potential in Africa. As the topic suggests, we will be going through the various traditional sources of domestic resources, as well as the potential domestic resources in Africa. But quickly, let us outline the presentation. We will give briefly the objectives. We will go through the expected learning outcomes, and then the content of the module, the second module. We will try not to go slide by slide, try as much as possible to make it as interactive as possible, given the limitations of video. So the contents will be traditional sources, emerging inclusive sources of domestic resources, the CFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and other sources. Basically the stolen money we will quantify and we provide evidence. Now, the objectives. The objectives are just as follows. We will try and highlight the sources, traditional sources of domestic resources. We will introduce participants to the emerging inclusive sources of domestic resources. We will highlight the domestic resource potentials of the identified sources, such as tax revenue, mineral earnings, remittances, and so on and so forth. We will then discuss the role of CFTA in resource mobilization. Now, what do we expect to learn at the end of this course? We think that you should be able to identify the traditional, emerging, and other sources of domestic resource mobilization. We think you should be able to identify the resource potential for the identified sources of domestic resources, analyze benefits of CFTA, differentiate between private and public sources of DRM, that is domestic resource mobilization, and understand the importance of each of the sources of domestic resource mobilization. So let's go quickly over the model, over the contents. As stated earlier, we will not try and go, slide by slide. That you can do on your own. We will make it as interesting as possible. So, traditional sources, emerging inclusive sources, CFTA, and other sources. Now let's start with traditional sources. The whole idea of domestic public finance is important because countries have to provide public goods and services. They have to increase equity and manage their macroeconomic stability. It's also important because there are sources of finance that could provide important additional development resources if we are managed to tap them properly. Thirdly, there are policy actions taken so far to increase the total development resource envelope, which do not really sufficiently recognize that African countries need to step up their own efforts at enhancing DRM. And lastly, successful programs are cost-effective. They return many times what you invest in them. So let us think about what the environment you need in order to be able to mobilize resources domestically. Obviously, you need a sustained economic growth. Now, in order to generate adequate resources, the wealth of the country will need to grow. Growth and structural transformation are therefore the prerequisites to DRM because they create the wealth from which revenue can be generated. And it really makes sense. If you don't create wealth, you cannot mobilize wealth. This is as simple as that. Poverty levels, inequalities in incomes must fall progressively. Socioeconomic infrastructure, which encourage and support investment and efficient social services, must be available in order to create the condition for sustainable development and therefore to mobilize domestic resources. This condition is required to develop the activity base for the generation of domestic resources that will be mobilized for economic transformation. Therefore, economic growth is totally necessary to achieve success in domestic resource mobilization. Economic growth in Africa stabilized around 3.4 in 2019. By the end of this year, it should pick up to 3.9. And if we are lucky and under normal circumstances, by the end of 2021, we should be talking about 4.1% in terms of growth. But COVID-19 has set off the first recession in sub-Saharan Africa, at least, the first one in the last 25 years. So growth forecast now, due to COVID-19, will be between minus 2.1 and minus 5.1. So now perish the dream of achieving 4.1% this year and 3.9% at the end of this year. Let's perish that thought, thanks to COVID-19. Therefore, the growth fundamentals will have to improve, obviously, with a shift from private consumption to investment and export. Investment has to account for more than half of the Africa's growth, with private consumption accounting for less than 1/3. This is because sufficient condition is for the growth to be accompanied by structural transformation as resources move from low productivity, low value adding activities to high productivity and high value adding activities which generate decent jobs. Now, the whole idea of domestic savings, we're talking about mobilizing domestic resources. Therefore, it is important to pay attention to the picture on domestic savings in Africa. It represents an effective instrument, and we will see that shortly in this course, in the mobilization of domestic resources. Savings as a precaution implies that even at low disposable income levels, and even in the absence of attractive savings instruments, poor households need to save a substantial part of their income. What that means simply is that there is no excuse not to save if we are thinking about having a pool of resources domestically to mobilize for our development. However, the capacity to save is determined by income level, is determined by the rate of income growth, and the dependency ratio. In addition, the willingness to save, nonetheless, is dependent on the ease of access to savings instruments, the attractiveness of such instruments, and the prevailing economic conditions. Instruments for household in Africa fall into 2, 3 non-financial savings, informal financial savings, formal financial savings, and if you think about the fourth one, semi-formal financial savings. Therefore, the composition of the household savings portfolio determines the availability of funds for investment. Savings in the formal sector is mainly done for short-term purposes, attracting insignificant interest. And all of us are familiar with savings that say you get an interest of 0.2%, 0.1%. Yeah. While that of informal sector is made to smoothen consumption. In the absence of credit, accessible credit and insurance services, drawing on saved assets is a necessary strategy for households smoothing their consumption patterns. The indication The indication, therefore, is that household savings held in non-financial and or informal instrument weakens the links between savings and investment, therefore compromising economic diversification. To address this situation, we think that African governments will have to develop strategies and mechanisms for financializing rural household savings. Now, let us talk about foreign direct investment. It is the so-called FDI. Where it is successful, it has good implication for growth and economic diversification in African countries. In Africa, FDI continues to be the main conduit for private investment. We have a few hotspots in Africa. For example, there is a significant shift away from extractive industries towards consumer-related sectors. Years ago, all FDIs were concentrated in countries that had natural resources. But now they're moving towards technology, towards media, telecoms, retail, and consumer products, as well as some financial instruments. So FDI projects in the real estate, hospital, and construction sector are also increasing. Now, how about remittances? Remittances from the diaspora. They represent an important inflow of resources to many African countries, but their potential remains very largely untapped. Remittance workers and now constitute the second largest external capital inflow to developing countries. In Africa, we have seen that remittances have been increasing over the years, and they are now an important resource pool for development, even though recorded inflows remain smaller than ODA or FDI. For many households in Africa, remittances are critical source of finance and foreign exchange. They help to stabilize the regular incomes and to build human and social capital. As we all know, remittances are used particularly to meet urgent needs in the family, hospital bills, student school fees, and debt that has to be paid off, and so on and so forth. So receivers are typically better off than their peers who don't have this kind of thing. So if you are getting remittances, even if it is $100 monthly, in a city or a village in any African country, generally speaking, you are better off than the person who does not have this kind of access. At the national level, remittances have a substantial effect on the balance of payments and on foreign exchange revenues. Now, let us talk about tax revenue as well as tax administration. A good tax administration usually will yield a good base in tax revenue. Tax, as we all know, is one of the biggest sources of public finance in developing countries. They are important domestic resource and have a role to play that is distinct as well as complementary to the role of private savings. Africa has a good potential to raise more domestic resources from efficient tax administration system, and that's because tax revenue constitutes the most significant source of domestic resources for the implementation of development programs on the continent, and there is significant potential for scaling up returns. And this is precisely why in many African countries where the tax administration is effective, e.g. Ethiopia, tax evasion is taken very, very seriously, because when you don't pay your tax, government cannot provide the goods, the public goods that it must provide in order for society to continue in the appropriate fashion. In the wake of general reduction in trade-related taxes under WTO, the expansion of VAT, the value-added tax, serve to fill in a significant part of the revenue generation gap. It's been easier to implement and administer than direct income or profit taxes. But where in many countries where people try to evade tax, they rarely can evade VAT. So countries have been able to bridge that gap, the revenue generation between taxes by just paying attention to the VAT. However, despite significant reforms to both tax policy and administration, tax mobilization performance has been mixed, limited by structural factors such as low per capita income and very small tax bases despite the growth profile. Almost all of the increase in tax revenue mobilization in Africa has come in the form of taxes and other revenues collected from the natural resources sector. Now, another traditional source is capital market. It can be mobilized at national or at continental stock exchanges, even sub-regional. Deep, transparent, and accessible capital markets are very important element in the financial sector. As a vehicle for long-term investment, finance, and for diversification of funding sources, capital markets strengthen the overall economy and they render it more resilient in the face of economic shocks. Capital markets in Africa are slowly developing and are beginning to play an increasingly important role. In addition, domestic institutional investors such as banks, insurance companies, pension funds, and local private investors dominate the investor base in African capital market. Bond markets are also in their infant stages. Debt markets are dominated by government securities. Corporate debt markets are largely non-existent in Africa, except for South Africa and some North African countries. Benchmark yield curves either do not exist, or where they do, they seldom extend further than 5 years. In addition, portfolio equity investment in Africa are focused only, almost exclusively, in South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Mauritius, and Zimbabwe. These are the most active and the most liquid stock markets that we have in terms of dollars and cents. However, only the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is visible globally. Now, let's quickly talk about emerging, inclusive, and innovative sources of domestic resources. Now, because of the shortcomings associated with the traditional sources, as we have just highlighted, there's now the need to pay attention to some innovative sources. International financial market present a largely untapped pool of capital to finance structural transformation of the African continent, while institutional investors also have the potential to provide an additional source of long-term finance. These emerging, inclusive and innovative sources of domestic resources are as follows, and I will just go through the slides quickly so that we can move forward. There's the diaspora bonds, which we have talked about earlier on. It's about $400 billion by some estimates, but it is largely untapped. There's the untapped potential as a development instrument. The basic rationale behind this mechanism is that diaspora purchases bonds issued by their country of origin with a patriotic discount, meaning that they do not seek as high a risk premium as pure market logic would suggest. And I can give an example quickly on this by referring to the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, which was completely funded internally and largely by diaspora bonds. The people who subscribe to this are not essentially looking for profit. They want to be part of something greater than that in their own country. So the diaspora bonds therefore have element of philanthropy since the motivation to purchase them is not linked solely to financial gains, as I just expressed with a reference to the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. At the same time, they are not patriotic charity, since they enable the leveraging of philanthropy into a long-term financing instrument that has the potential to raise large amounts of capital for needed investment. Sovereign wealth funds, whose purpose really is to ensure that resources of a country are not just wasted by the current generation of rulers. Sovereign wealth funds are usually there so that the coming generation can have something to live on, to base development on. There is when we talk about this, I think usually about the sovereign wealth funds in Nigeria, the one in the Polar fund in Botswana. They set up generally to stabilize government's fiscal or foreign exchange revenues and macroeconomic aggregates by smoothing out fluctuations in prices of export commodities. By creating these funds, the policymakers usually just try to smooth the volatility of resource-driven revenues by lowering the effects of boom and bust cycles resulting from volatility in commodity prices. In this way, sovereign wealth funds could be used to absorb large foreign exchange surpluses. Let's go to, the example as given here. We have the sovereign funds in Nigeria, which in 2012, announced a management team and a seed capital of $1 billion. We have Angola, Fundo Soberano de Angola, or FSDEA, in 2012, with $5 billion in assets. And let's go to pension funds. They offer an enormous promise as a continental source of investment capital. African pension funds, estimated at over $29 billion, can play a critical role in Africa's economic development. The growth of pension funds industries opens up a substantial opportunity for financial sector development on the continent and overall economic development. The African continent pension fund industry is really growing in size, in ambition, and it's a product of the region's robust economic growth and reforms in a number of countries. But keep in mind that this is also subject to shocks that you may suffer from unplanned global activities or global events or global tragedies, such as COVID-19. If the economy contracts, then it might affect the pool of funds available, especially if thousands of workers are retrenched or are fired. Now, the African Infrastructure Development Fund. This was proposed in the work that we did years ago, and I will go to that work shortly. It was proposed in the study of the domestic resource mobilization in Africa. The idea was to serve the need of countries that may not be able to finance their infrastructural development. So we thought, why not set up a fund that could speak to that directly, that African countries can use to develop their power plants, ICT, roads, bridges, ports, and so on and so forth. This kind of fund is needed since market perception of the high risk in long-term infrastructure means domestic and international financiers are not unconstrained. The truth of the matter is that if you are going to build infrastructure, it may be difficult for you to secure the sort of loan that you use for other things, because the roads don't bring back too many returns apart from tolls and other. And financiers, investors are really not interested uh, in funding very low return projects such as toll roads and stuff. Now, so this fund is then therefore necessary for this kind of project. In addition, we have the African Development Bank, some regional banks, and other multilateral banks. They are constrained in their lending capacity for all sorts of reasons. That that they cannot that are actually beyond their control. Some of them are bound by board decisions not to give more than a little percent of available funds for infrastructure. So we thought this kind of fund will be very, very crucial for this purpose. So if we can create this kind of fund, or this, then it can be used to supplement investment in national and regional infrastructure projects. Infrastructure bonds. The issuance of long-term debt instrument by African countries, specifically infrastructure bonds, to raise finance for infrastructure development is new, and there are very few in Africa. We have some in Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa. Because of the short-term maturity of the loans offered by the banking sector, these are not suitable for financing long-term investment in infrastructure development. Therefore, developing a viable and vibrant bond market is critical for development. Now, the public-private partnership, these are very important, but there are so many variations. We will go through them quickly. As you know, PPP, public-private partnership, is a funding model for public infrastructure projects such as new telecommunication systems, airports, power plants. These have been used across Africa in many, many countries. Generally, the government is the public partner in this kind of deal. PPP is a broad term. It can be applied to anything from simple short-term management contract to a long-term contract that includes funding, planning, building, operation, maintenance, and divestiture. If you look at this scheme, and we will look at it quickly and come back to it. Look at the center, the project of the SPV, special purpose vehicle. Suppose this is the infrastructure project right in the middle. Right in the middle here, now you have the government here, you have the people who are financing, might be in the private sector, you have some experts, and what links the project and the government is a concession agreement. So we'll come back to this shortly, but keep this in mind when we talk about various configurations of PPP. Now, there are at least five broad categories. Five broad categories, in terms of PPP, and they are supply and management contract, the turnkey projects. Hopefully, we'll come back to that. The lease affirmage, private ownership of assets. Now, going through it one by one will be laborious, but the key thing to understand is that when you see the basic feature, say in the franchise arrangement, for example, the concessionaire provides services that are fully specified by the franchising authority. Private sector carries commercial risks. They may be required to make investments. The basic features of BOT we call the build, operate, and transfer. A type of arrangement. In this one, the concessionaire undertakes investment and operates the facility for a fixed period of time, after which ownership reverts back to the public sector. That is, build it, operate it, then transfer. And then we have the build, rehabilitate, operate, transfer, or build, lease, and transfer. So these are basic features. Then there is a DB, the design and build, O&M, operation and maintenance, design, build, finance, operate, DBFO. There's the build, own, and operate, build, own, operate, and transfer, buy, build, operate, where the publicly owned asset is legally transferred to a private sector partner for a particular period of time set in the agreement. Then there's BLOT, the build, lease, operate, transfer. Then there's the operation license. Finance only. In finance only, the private sector partner, usually a finance company, funds the infrastructure component and charges the public sector partner interest for use of the funds. So that's the financially. Now, we were talking earlier on about the SPV, the special purpose vehicle, which is a key feature of most PPPs. If you recall the graphics that we just saw a few slides back, where the SPV is right at the center, and you have the government above there, and they are connected by some kind of agreement, and you have the private sector, you have the experts, So the SPV is just a legal entity that undertakes a project. They have a contractual agreement between the various parties. SPVs are usually preferred mode of PPP projects in limited or non-recourse situation, where the lenders rely on the project's cash flow and security over its assets as the only means to repay debt. So, however, the actual structure of a PPP depends on the type of partnership, and we have gone through numerous type of partnerships based on whether you are building, operating, and transferring, whether you are just financing, and so on and so forth. A joint venture, now, joint venture is an operating company owned by a government entity as well as a private company. It's also a variation of PPP as we're talking. Often the SPV, the special purpose vehicle, is formed as a joint venture between an experienced construction company and a service operations company capable of operating and maintaining the project. Well, what are the reasons for direct government involvement in projects? Other than the strategic, financial, and economic interest, government may take interest in projects for so many reasons. It could be to address political sensitivity and fulfill social obligations. In this respect, think about the construction of the dam, for example. Construction of the dam. It could be to ensure commercial viability, where the project is considered too risky to financiers and investors, and they just don't want to come because they say, well, maybe this is not viable. So the government perceives a social obligation in that project and moves in to say, okay, we will support part of this. It could also be to provide confidence to lenders. This is the whole idea of de-risking a project. When a government gets involved in a project, it offers some kind of confidence to investors to come in. As they say in many African countries, they say if you are going to lend a dress from somebody, you first see what they are wearing. Therefore, the investors will say, if this is a viable project, why is the government not part of it? That is just the argument. Therefore, the government gives confidence to the lenders or the investors by being part of that project. Or it may also be just to have an insight into how to protect public interest, so that you don't leave it totally to private sector, and then they start seeking unreasonable rent. Now, we did talk about the potentials right there now. We have discussed the innovative ones, we have discussed the traditional sources, but what are the resource potentials in Africa right now? Suppose we want to harness what we have right now. What do we have available? So in the next few slides, we will cover this quickly. Without going through all of this, in terms of domestic taxes, as we have said, Africa raises more than $520 billion annually in domestic taxes, as against 59 billion that the Africa receives in private flows and another 50 billion in ODA. So as we had stressed earlier on, taxes remain the most critical source of domestic resources. Africa also earns $168 billion every year from minerals and mineral fuels. And we have about $400 billion in reserves held in central banks across Africa. The diaspora remittances we spoke earlier on about climbed to about 40 billion in 2012 and represented a significant portion of total global remittances, which is about 351 billion globally. For Africa, it is about 40 billion. The World Bank estimates that in the next decade, the amount remitted by African diaspora could grow to $200 billion over the next 10 years alone. Then Africa has the potential to raise another 5 billion, between 5 billion and $10 billion annually in the capital market if we securitize these remittances from the diaspora. So if we securitize the $40 billion in the capital market, put it in the capital market, you can raise an additional $5 to $10 billion. In Africa, as at 2007, when we did our study, stock market capitalization had risen from $300 billion in 1996 to $1.2 trillion, $1.2 trillion in 2007. Indications are this has increased tremendously as at 2019, 2018, 2019. 39 African countries issued treasury bills. 27 offer treasury bonds. There are more than 700 bonds worth $206 billion in African countries as at 2011. Banking revenues, which are the revenues charged by banks when you do transactions, across Africa, it's around $60 billion a year, billion dollars. As we said earlier on, about 10 African countries have established sovereign wealth funds. And the private market, the private equity market, is also worth more than 30 billion. In 2011, as far back as that, the equity firms were able to raise $1.5 billion for transactions in Africa. There is increasing capacity within African regional development finance institutions to fund cross-border projects in pursuit of regional integration. As earlier stated, revenues from banks are $60 billion across the continent. So all these are pointers to financial resources that are there right now that could be leveraged, that could be harnessed for the purpose of African development. Now, this graphic just shows everything I've said in one slide. You see the tax revenue per annum, the mineral earnings, diaspora remittances, when we securitize the remittance, the equity market, bank revenues, the pension assets, international reserves held in central banks, diaspora excess remittance cost, stock market capitalization, private equity market, which is about 30 billion, and illicit financial flows, which constitute about $854 billion over the last 10 years at the rate of about $50 billion per annum, taken illegally from Africa. Let's be clear. This is money stolen from Africa every year in illicit flows. We will be dealing with this in Module 5 especially, so that you have an idea what it is, how we can stop it in Africa, what efforts are being made to stop it and to get back our money, and how successful these efforts have been. So let's just go quickly on CFTA. As we all know, CFTA is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It is expected to go into force in January 2021. The CFTA is expected to lead into a single African market, which permits what we call the four freedoms and paves way for expanded intra-African trade, increased harmonization, competitiveness, and better distribution of resources. To achieve all of this, a rigorous process of negotiation is ongoing. We are in phase 2 now, by which should be concluded before in due course. Let's not put any timing on this, since we do not have a handle on how the negotiation is going on, especially in the context of COVID-19. VAT as a replacement tax to loss of revenue from trade issues. One of the reasons that countries were reluctant initially in terms of CFTA was to say, wait a minute, we are going to be losing money, and to implement this CFTA is going to cost us more headache than we need. We'd rather stay the way we are now. Happily, many countries, 54 countries have signed, 30 countries have ratified. So we are working on the rest of the countries. Now, contrary to the fears so this slide is on how we can replace the possible loss of revenue from trade with VAT. So contrary to the fears of many member states, that the reduction or elimination of tariffs will spur an increase in the volume of imports and serve to expand the tax base, from which will stem more tax revenue. Contrary to the fears, the fear has been we are going to lose money, and we don't want to do this. Now, what we argue is that the reduction, when you reduce or you eliminate tariffs, you spur volume of imports. There's an increase in the volume of import, and therefore this serves as a tax base where you can derive more tax revenue. So CFTA has the potential of bringing about trade creation in this manner, which may eventually then increase the taxable base and welfare of the people. Now, keep in mind, this is critically important. You reduce or you eliminate tariffs. Once you do that, you almost immediately, you can trigger an increase in the imports. And once you trigger an increase in the imports, you are expanding your tax base, and then you are getting more tax revenue. That is the argument. So, contrary to the fears of many African countries, the CFTA will not make them lose revenue in the manner that they are projecting. Trade creation, which CFTA will do, can be attained when the volume of traded products increases due to the customs union, thereby on aggregate increasing the total consumption in the domestic market. Simultaneously, it is expected to lead to a reduction in prices of goods that are in abundance. Keep in mind that you have spurred an increase in the volume of imports. That import increase then results in an abundance in the domestic market, thus providing consumers with the option of choosing the cheaper domestic products over the imported products. And of course, this usually will result in a reduction in prices. It's the usual demand and supply, and price equilibrium situation. Therefore, in the medium to long term, when we have deeper regional integration, we can promote local production and we can boost domestic resource mobilization in Africa. This is the way that CFTA can help to boost domestic resource mobilization through deeper regional integration. Now, VAT should be used as a replacement tax to mitigate the revenue losses from trade taxes. Yeah, let's go quickly to another condition that is critical in order for us to derive the most benefit from CFTA relative to the domestic resource mobilization. There is always the talk about harmonizing the tax policies across Africa, because for us to integrate to establishing customs union, later a monetary union, an inadequate level of harmonization of tax policy members will compromise the whole integration process. What does that mean? Across African countries, if a country has a tax policy that is retrogressive, another one has one that is progressive, another one does not even have anyone that you can regard as policy, it's not going to work out for the integration and therefore for the implementation of CFTA. Therefore, we need to find a way to harmonize the tax policies across Africa. And taxes are a symbol of sovereignty. Member states usually will be reluctant. They say they are independent, they have the right to charge what they want, thereby they will compromise that later stages of African integration. Happily, many of our regs are working on this, getting an harmonized schedules regarding specific products and services. Harmonizing tax policy is also important for the removal of tax distortions, improving investment climate, and realizing economic growth. Most importantly, harmonizing tax policies has a great potential of limiting competition, undue competition across Africa and across countries, as well as harmful tax practices by countries which are always aimed at attracting foreign direct investment. So what that means is that when you have tax policies in disharmony that are running riot all over the place, what happens is a very harmful competition across the countries. Some countries will manipulate their tax practices just because they want to attract the foreign direct investment. Now, there is the whole negotiation now going on regarding e-commerce as part of phase 2, or maybe possibly phase 3 aspect of the CFTA negotiation. The whole idea is that the African economy is moving quickly to becoming a digital one, to the extent that the African Union is now working on a digital economy policy for the whole continent. Right now, because we have no rules, we have no way of taxing digitalized businesses, African countries are losing millions of dollars in revenue. Therefore, we may want to consider introduction of interim rules to tax highly digitalized businesses in the interim. It might be unilateral, since we are still at an advanced stage right now. The CFTA protocol on e-commerce is being negotiated as part of phase 2, or it could even be a separate self-standing phase 3 negotiation. It may be informed by ATAF's ongoing work on the subject to craft a unified regulation on e-commerce. This can be used as a tool to deepen African integration while preserving needed tax revenue, which is usually the number one concern on African countries when they're thinking about a common trade area. Now let's talk quickly about the other sources, the money that are stolen, and then try and give evidence of the theft. International asset recovery is any effort by government to repatriate the proceeds of corruption hidden in foreign jurisdiction. International asset recovery exercises have been very, very pronounced in the African continent over the last few years. Egypt, Nigeria, and a few other countries where huge amounts of money have been sorted away by unscrupulous officials or business people, or even transnational corporations. So this asset recovery system is put in motion by governments. The aim really is to recover the money, either the proceeds of corruption, theft, uh, steep business practices. Now, the heads of anti-corruption agencies in Africa recently asked heads of government in Europe and America and other jurisdictions to speedily recover stolen funds to African countries. Unfortunately, when money leaves Africa and gets deposited in these countries in Europe and America, getting it back is usually very, very difficult. As I said, we will deal with this essentially in Module 5 when we discuss illicit financial flows. The plea of African agencies was contained in a communique issued at the end of the 9th Commonwealth Regional Conference of Anti-Corruption Agencies in Africa, which was held in Uganda. The agencies called on heads of government and Commonwealth Africa anti-corruption agencies to engage and empower citizens to demand transparency, accountability, and effective service delivery. The withholding of stolen assets from Africa has become a sore point in relationship between Africa and the countries in Europe and America. And it is understandable if billions of dollars are stolen from African continent and kept in your countries, it becomes a major source of financing for the country of destination, no matter how illegal it is. It is immoral for the countries to keep these assets away from Africa and refusing to return them. In the light of this, there was the move by anti-corruption agencies in Africa to recover the money and in a timely and apt manner. Assets recovery is fraught, however, with the complicity of the banks involved, the navigation of costly international legal labyrinth, and the fact that those most implicated in public looting also have the power and influence to stop recovery. That is the reality of the matter. No matter whether they are politicians, businessmen, transnational corporations, these are the same people and organizations and companies with the most power to scuttle all attempts at asset recovery. In Nigeria, plans are in motion to distribute $322 million recovered in Switzerland from the late military ruler Sani Abacha, who was suspected to have looted between $3 and $5 billion in public money salted away outside Africa in various countries. Where institutions of accountability are not working well, such cases pose a very complex problem. We have to make sure that the money is not embezzled and actually benefit the real victims of corruption. So the whole idea is that when the money is recovered, we have to make sure that this system is in place that makes sure that the money is not re-stolen or re-embezzled, and that it is used fundamentally for the development needs of the country. Now, in 2006, $723 million that was illicitly acquired by Abacha's family was returned to Nigeria from Switzerland in 723 million. Nigeria recovered 311 million of the alleged stolen funds, from Abacha. In 1999, another 750 million was recovered. In 2002, $1.2 billion was recovered, again by Nigeria. 149 million in 2003 from UK. 500 million recovered in 2004 from Switzerland. And another $458 million was recovered in 2005, again from Switzerland. During the last Jonathan administration, $1 billion was recovered. In 2012, $380 million recovered in 2015 from Switzerland. The same administration, Jonathan administration, also recovered $227 million from Liechtenstein in 2014, and from the United States, $48 million in 2014 too. In 2017, $322 million was recovered from Switzerland in 2017, and $308 million from United Kingdom in 2020. That is the most current by the Nigerian government. So of the 4 countries, Switzerland tops the list of recovery. Now, you may be asking why the emphasis on Nigeria. When we go to module 5 and we present the 10 countries that are most guilty of illicit financial flows, you will discover that Nigeria tops the list. Essentially, over 1/3 of illicit financial flows from Africa comes from Nigeria. So that explains the concentration on recoveries of monies that have been recovered by Nigeria from the destination countries. So a total of about $2.6 billion so far repatriated to Nigeria came from Switzerland, while others came from UK and United States. Now, let us end this exercise by reflecting on some basic questions that you can think of. What are the major sources of domestic resources in your country? And what are their implications for investment and structural transformation of your economy? So what are the sources? What are the major sources? And what do they mean for investment? Either in size, either in flow, either in management. What are the implications for investment and structural transformation of your country's economy? Using concrete examples from your country, discuss the extent to which mobilization of domestic resources in Africa is a function of governance. Now, what does this mean? Is it the case that where there is a stable, excellent governance, there will be more domestic resources? Is that the case? Or essentially, does governance play a peripheral role in domestic resource mobilization? So use concrete examples and discuss the extent to which mobilization of domestic resources is a function of governance. Which of the instruments of domestic resource mobilization do you consider most challenging, and why? Go back to all the instruments of domestic resource mobilization. Think about the resource potentials. Which one are most challenging, and why? What are the challenges that you think you perceive as impediments to the major sources of domestic resource mobilizations in your country? What are the challenges? Why do you think your country will have difficulty in mobilizing domestic resources? Think about all the other diaspora bond, infrastructure bonds, banking charges, and so on and so forth. Lastly, how effective are tax amnesties How effective are tax amnesties, and should this be used as a tool to reset tax relations with consumers and firms? Tax amnesties usually are when when tax evasion is forgiven for particular purposes, so that you can either pay what you owe and sin no more, and then you start. That's the whole idea of resetting tax relations with the payers, with either the consumers or with with firms who have owned a lot of money, that making them pay can actually crumble the business and make people go out of business or become unemployed. Everybody loses in that way. So usually countries would offer these amnesties. It is a manner of saying don't sin anymore. We are going to forgive this. You pay this little one, and from here on, you keep paying your taxes. So we have reset our tax relations. So this is the end of this module 2, but let us keep this conversation going. My email address is adeyemi, adeyemi, at UN, that's United Nations, UN.org. And the Twitter handle is at adeyemi. Let's keep the conversation going. Domestic resources are crucial to African development, and the sources are increasing with our imagination and with the level of innovation that we can muster. Thank you all, and have a good day.